The people who live the longest on Earth don't finish their meals. On purpose. For years, the leading theory for why was genetics. Good genes, a lucky bloodline, passed down through a handful of island families. Then researchers actually ran the numbers on twins, separated and studied over decades. Genetics turned out to explain maybe a fifth of it. The other four-fifths was behavior. And one specific behavior kept showing up in the data more than any other. And the strange part is, that behavior isn't about willpower, and it isn't about small portions either. It's about a completely different definition of when a meal, or honestly most things in life, is actually supposed to end. Look at your own last meal for a second. Did you decide it was over, or did the plate decide for you, simply by running out? Most people have never actually asked themselves that question, and the answer usually says more than the ingredients ever could. Stay until item 6, where you'll meet a woman who's spent decades opening her own small stall 3 mornings a week. And the reason she gives for why has almost nothing to do with food, but everything to do with the number in this video's title. Item 3 has an actual routine that's been broadcast on national Japanese radio, live, every single morning for the last 98 years, unchanged. And the last item on this list is the quiet one. It's not about eating, moving, or resting. It's about how much of your own opinion you let take up space in a room. And in a traditional Japanese household, that habit says more about someone's character than anything else here. Let's get into it. There's a phrase for this, and it's Hara, Hachi, Bu. Literally, belly 8 parts out of 10. Okinawans have said it for generations, almost like a table grace right before or after a meal. The rule underneath it, stop eating at roughly 80% full every time, no matter how good the food is or how much is left on the plate. The idea is old. A physician named Kaibara Eken wrote it down back in 1713, arguing that moderation, not medicine, was the biggest lever anyone had over their own lifespan. It took root hardest in Okinawa, and centuries later, that's exactly where longevity researchers came looking for an explanation. Now, honestly, there's real academic pushback on parts of this story. Some researchers have questioned how reliable Okinawa's oldest birth records actually are, and whether the centenarian counts are slightly inflated. That's a fair fight, and it's still open. But the behavior itself, stopping short on purpose at 80%, shows up independent of that argument, and it's the pattern this entire video is going to test, again and again, against 7 different corners of daily life. Here's where it splits from the Western default. American food culture draws one line, and it's a line about regret. Did you enjoy the meal, or do you feel bad about it after? Enjoy fully or restrict fully. That's the whole binary. Japan draws a second, more precise line inside that same plate. Not did I enjoy this, but did I stop before my body forced me to? That's a completely different question, and it doesn't just apply to food. It's not a diet with an end date you're counting down to. It's closer to a permanent setting, dialed to roughly 80%, left running quietly in the background of an entire life. Keep that map in mind. Every habit on this list comes back to it. Picture your last big dinner out. 1 plate, 1 main course taking up most of the real estate, a side or 2 pushed into whatever space is left, and a portion size decided by the kitchen, not by you. At a buffet, the math gets worse. Flat price. So some part of your brain treats every extra trip back to the food line as a discount you're owed. Nutritionists spent years assuming the real secret to Okinawa's diet was what was on the plate. More fish, more vegetables, less red meat. All true, and none of it is actually the detail that explains the gap. The bigger difference is that there usually isn't one big plate at all. The standard format is called Ichiju Sansai. 1 soup, 3 dishes. Rice, miso soup, and 3 small separate dishes, each modest on its own. Nothing about it is portioned by a kitchen trying to make you feel like you got your money's worth. Try this the next time you sit down to eat. Look at your plate before the first bite and ask whether that portion was set by your own hunger or by whoever plated it. Most of the time, it wasn't you. A single oversized plate makes the decision before you've taken a bite. Several small dishes hand the decision back to you, one dish at a time. The shift. A meal that hands you the whole decision at once, in one plate, rarely gets interrupted. A meal built out of several small decisions gets a natural pause built into nearly every one of them. That's the shape of the meal. The next habit is about the exact moment the meal is allowed to be finished, and it turns out that moment has its own name. Think about snacking. Not dinner, the in-between hours. A handful of chips while scrolling, another handful 20 minutes later, a few more bites on the way past the kitchen. None of that gets logged as a meal, because none of it had a clear beginning or end. It just happened, spread thin, with no moment where your brain got the signal that eating time was over. You'd think the fix for that is more willpower. It isn't. It's punctuation. In Japan, a meal ends with a specific, spoken moment. Before eating, there's itadakimasu, a small acknowledgement of the food and the people who made it. After eating, there's gochisu-sama, roughly, thank you, that was a feast, said out loud even for a simple bowl of noodles at a counter. It's tiny, but it draws a hard line at the end of the meal your brain actually registers. This is the same 80% principle from a different angle. Stopping at 80% full only works if you can tell when the meal has ended in the first place. Grazing with no defined endpoint makes that impossible. There's no 80% to stop at, because there's no clear 100% to measure against. A closing phrase sounds too simple to matter, but it gives eating a shape, the same way punctuation gives a sentence one. The shift. Food eaten with no beginning and no end doesn't get evaluated at all. It just accumulates. A meal with a spoken close, even a 2-second one, is a meal your body actually gets to finish deciding about. Researchers who study eating behavior expected the biggest driver of overeating to be taste, food that's simply too delicious to stop eating. The bigger driver, again and again, turned out to be the absence of a clear stopping cue. Remove the cue, and even bland food gets eaten past the point of hunger. Those first two habits live inside a single meal. The next one has nothing to do with food, and everything to do with why gym memberships in most countries spike every January and quietly die by March. Fitness researchers spent decades chasing a single question. What's the most efficient workout? The shortest number of minutes for the biggest possible result. Okinawa never really asked that question. The goal was never efficiency. It was never stopping in the first place. There's a 3-minute radio program called Radio Taiso, Radio Calisthenics, a mild set of stretches and light movements broadcast on national radio every single morning since 1928. Same 3 minutes. Same simple routine. 98 years running, mild enough that a 7-year-old and an 80-year-old can do it side by side without either one needing to build up to it. Do the math on why that number wins. A brutal hour-long session done 8 times before it collapses is 8 hours total, ever. A 3-minute habit held for even 1 decade clears 100 hours without ever once asking for more than a person could actually give that particular morning. This is the 80% rule applied to movement instead of food, not the most effort you can tolerate in one sitting, but roughly most of your effort, repeated so consistently it stops registering as effort at all. The shift. A workout that leaves you wrecked teaches your body to dread the next one. A habit that never asks for everything is the one you're still doing in your 70s. Nobody designed Radio Taiso to be exciting. That was never the goal. The goal was that nobody would ever have a good reason to skip it. And 98 years of continuous, unbroken mornings is what that decision actually bought. We've covered eating and moving. The next habit is about who you spend time with, and it produced a number that genuinely surprised the researchers who went looking for it. Think about your own social calendar over the last year. Stretches of feast, a wedding season, a few months of constant plans with certain friends, and stretches of famine, months where the same people barely cross your mind, no falling out, just drift. Most adult friendships in the West run on that boom and bust rhythm set by whatever else is loud in life at the moment. In Okinawa, many people belong to something called a moai, originally a small mutual support financial group, a handful of people pooling money regularly to help each other through hard stretches. The financial function faded for most groups over the generations. The gathering didn't. Researchers expected moai to matter about as much as any ordinary friend group does anywhere else. Instead, when they measured stress markers directly, the moai groups came out ahead by a margin large enough to rival diet and exercise combined. Nobody in a moai is texting constantly or spending every weekend together. It's a modest, sustainable 80%. Steady contact, low drama, low effort to maintain, held for so many decades that its total effect ends up outperforming friendships that only show up at full intensity. Moderate but permanent beats intense but temporary. The same principle running through a completely different part of a life. The shift. A friendship that only shows up at full intensity eventually runs out of occasions to justify itself. A friendship that shows up at a modest, steady level never needs an occasion at all. Think about which of your own friendships would survive a rule like that. The same low-key gathering, on the same schedule for the next 30 years, with nothing exciting required to justify it. For most people, that list is shorter than they'd like it to be. 2 habits left before the pause. The next one is going to sound like permission, because that's exactly what it is. You'd expect a country famous for overwork to have zero tolerance for sleeping in public. It's the opposite. In most American workplaces, tired isn't really a valid reason to stop. You push through, more coffee. Wait for the actual end of the day, because visible rest during work hours reads as visible weakness. In Japan, there's a long-standing socially accepted practice called inemuri, roughly sleeping while present. Commuters asleep upright on crowded trains, employees resting briefly at their own desks, and none of it reads as laziness. The logic runs almost backwards from the American one. Showing up exhausted and still present enough to nap for a few minutes is treated as commitment, not the lack of it. Now honestly, this isn't unlimited permission. Nobody's applauding a full shift spent asleep, and Inamuri has its own quiet social rules about when and how long. But the core habit still fits the map. A short, permitted dip in output, taken deliberately before total burnout, keeps the rest of the day usable. Running at full output until you physically collapse doesn't preserve more output. It just moves the collapse somewhere less convenient. Can you remember the last time you stopped working specifically because you were tired and not because the clock finally allowed it? For a lot of people, that memory doesn't exist, and that gap is exactly what this habit is pointing at. The shift. Rest that's only allowed after you've completely broken down isn't rest. It's damage control. Rest that's allowed at 80%, on the way there, is the version that actually works. We're heading into the final 2 items now, and the next one is the one I mentioned back at the very start of this video. Here's the woman I promised you at the start. She's in her 90s, and most mornings she's still at her own small stall by sunrise, selling whatever she grew or gathered the day before, not because she needs the income, and not because anyone's making her. When she's asked why she still gets up before dawn to do it, her answer is almost always some version of the same idea. This is still hers to do. She's not alone in that. Researchers documenting Okinawa's longevity came across a man in his 102nd year who still practiced karate forms alone at dawn, slow and precise, because passing on that discipline had become the thing his life was organized around. Another, 100 years old, still went out fishing 3 mornings a week to bring something home for his family, not because the family needed the fish. There's a word for what all 3 of them have. It's ikigai, roughly a reason for being. Not a grand mission, a small specific role that simply never fully closes. Here's where the American default breaks hardest against the map. Retirement, as most Western economies define it, is a cliff. Full output until a fixed date, then a sudden, total drop to zero structured purpose. Ikigai is the 80% principle applied to an entire life instead of a single day. Never all the way at full output, but never fully at zero either. A small, sustained role, indefinitely, instead of a career that ends in a hard stop. What you keep doing, at whatever pace your life allows, is a better predictor of how long that life lasts than almost anything else on this list. Stop here. Let that land. What you keep doing, at whatever pace your life allows, is a better predictor of how long that life lasts than almost anything else on this list. The shift. A life built around a finish line eventually runs out of a reason to keep going past it. A life built around a small, ongoing role never actually reaches one. None of these three woke up one morning and decided to have a purpose. The stall, the forms, the boat, they were already there, years before anyone thought to call it anything. The word came later. The habit came first. One habit left, and it's the quiet one I promised at the start. The one that isn't about your body at all. Last one, and this is the quiet one. The one that doesn't photograph well, doesn't show up in a longevity study, and still says the most about someone. Think about a conversation where you were completely certain you were right. Most instincts in an individualist culture say all of it. Claim the full space of your opinion. Hold your ground until the other person concedes. There's a Japanese concept for the alternative, and it's enryo, a deliberate, practiced restraint, holding back roughly the last portion of what you're entitled to say or claim, even when you technically could. It shows up in small ways, taking the smaller portion at a shared meal, not correcting someone in front of others even when you're right, leaving a little room in a conversation instead of filling every second of it. Now, honestly, some people find this frustrating from the outside. It can look like passivity or like withholding an honest opinion when one is genuinely needed. That criticism isn't baseless. But the intent isn't silence. It's the same principle as the food, running through speech instead of a plate, stopping just short of taking everything you technically could, on purpose, to leave room for whoever's sitting across from you. Slow down here. Consider that for a moment. The plate, the workout, the retirement date, and the conversation all failed the same test in the same way. Each one assumed that more, taken all the way to the edge, was automatically better. Not one of them turned out to be true. The shift. Taking up all the space you're entitled to in a room leaves nothing for anyone else in it. Leaving the last 20% unclaimed isn't a loss. It's the only part of the room the next person actually gets to use. 7 habits. One number showing up in 7 completely different corners of a life. Not a diet. Not a productivity hack. Just a decision, made over and over to stop slightly before you technically had to. 3 questions. 30 seconds. Run them against your own day right now. Question 1. Am I stopping because my body actually told me to, or because the plate, the workout, or the workday simply ran out first? The buffet plate, the all-or-nothing gym routine, that's where most people fail this test first. Question 2. Is this a habit I can sustain for decades, or only for a few intense weeks before it collapses? A moai that meets quietly for 30 years beats a friend group that burns bright for one summer. Japan's answer here is always the same: modest and permanent over intense and temporary. Question 3. If I stopped at 80% here, in this meal, this workout, this opinion, would anyone actually be worse off? Not could I have taken more, but did stopping here cost anything real? 3 questions, 30 seconds. If any habit in your day fails all 3, that's the first one to look at. Not the biggest one, just the first one. Look around your own life right now. Which of these 7 hit closest to home? The plate, the closing ritual, the 3 minutes, the moai, the nap, the reason that never retires, or the room you leave a little open? Tell me the number 1 through 7 in the comments right now. And if this changed how you're looking at your own plate or your own calendar, share it with one person who still thinks finishing everything is the goal.
See you in the next one.